The heavy metal stapler flew past my ear, missing my skull by less than 2 inches before it slammed into the office drywall with a loud thud. The impact left a jagged dent in the beige paint, scattering plaster dust onto my shoulder. Julian Crawford stood across from my desk, his face flushed a deep crimson, chest heaving under a custom-tailored linen shirt. He was screaming that his uncle owned this firm and would fire me by the end of the day anyway. I had just refused to falsify the hazardous runoff logs for the Oak Haven chemical facility. People lived directly downstream from that chemical plant, and children swam in the local creek every summer. When the door behind Julian clicked open, our largest corporate client, Harvey Pierce, stepped into the room with his smartphone raised, silently recording every second of the meltdown. Before I recount the rest of this mess, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. If you are dealing with corporate corruption or workplace bullies, this channel might give you the tools you need to stand your ground. What happened next completely dismantled my career, but it also gave me the ultimate leverage to rebuild my entire life. My name is Lawrence Vance, and until this nightmare unfolded, I had spent 7 years as the senior compliance analyst at Crawford Environmental. I had built a solid reputation for absolute precision and unwavering ethical standards in our field. My colleagues knew me as a quiet, methodical worker who rarely spoke up in meetings unless there was a critical regulatory issue that could put the firm or the public at risk. We were a small but prestigious consultancy that verified safety reports for industrial giants. It was a good living, and my boss of 7 years, Mr. George Crawford, had always treated me with respect. That all changed on a cold Monday morning 3 months ago. George walked into our open office with his arm draped over the shoulders of a tall, slick young man in an expensive Italian suit. He introduced him as Julian Crawford, our new project manager. George boasted that Julian had just graduated from a top business program and was here to bring modern efficiency to our department. What George conveniently left out was that his 24-year-old nephew had never actually worked a single day in the environmental compliance field. I watched my coworkers exchange nervous glances. Compliance is not an internship where you can make mistakes without consequences. One bad report can lead to contaminated drinking water, heavy fines, or worse. Yet George patted my back and told me to show Julian the ropes. From the very first week, the trouble began. Julian was obsessed with speed and billable hours, showing zero interest in the tedious science of compliance. He wore shoes that cost more than my monthly mortgage and treated the analysts like second-class citizens. In the second week, during a conference call with a client regarding soil sample regulations, Julian confidently suggested we bypass several federal testing protocols to wrap up the project early. After the call, I took him aside to explain that our standards were legally mandated by the Environmental Protection Agency. Skipping them would expose the client to millions of dollars in penalties and endanger local wildlife. Julian just smirked, adjusting his silk tie, and told me that rules were just speed bumps. He said his uncle always told him that business must move faster than slow government regulations. I should have reported his attitude to George right then, but I decided to handle it quietly. Over the next few weeks, I established a grueling routine to protect the firm from Julian's negligence. I let him handle the client meetings, which fed his massive ego, while I spent my evenings correcting his technical errors. When he mixed up testing parameters or ignored warnings on raw data, I stayed late to fix the files. My lunch breaks disappeared, and my weekends became a blur of checking and rechecking spreadsheets. I was exhausted, but I told myself it was worth it because the work was being done correctly. Then came the quarterly audit for the Clearwater chemical plant. It was our largest account, a massive industrial facility situated right next to the Cedar Ridge tributary, which supplied drinking water to 3 downstream communities. Julian was annoyed by how thorough I was during our 2-day site visit, complaining as I collected 15 separate water samples from the outflow gates. He wanted to head back to the city for a dinner reservation, but I insisted on completing every single checkpoint on my list. I knew the stakes were too high to rush, as the health of thousands of families depended on the accuracy of our report. I carefully labeled every single sample bottle, ensuring that no cross-contamination could occur, while Julian sat in the rental car, scrolling through his social media accounts and sighing loudly every few minutes. He could not comprehend why anyone would spend hours standing in the mud to measure chemical levels when we could just copy the data from the previous quarter's report. I ignored his complaints, focused entirely on doing my job properly. When the laboratory results came back 3 days later, my heart sank into my stomach. I stayed at my desk until midnight analyzing the chemical sheets that Clara, our lead technician, had prepared. I had known Clara for 5 years, and she was always meticulous. But these results were so shocking that she had run the tests twice just to be absolutely certain. The readings were clear and alarming. The concentration of nitrogen compounds and heavy metal residues in the water samples exceeded the federal safety limits by more than 300%. The contamination was originating from a deteriorating containment basin that had been neglected for years. Clearwater Chemical needed to shut down the line immediately and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on emergency repairs. I drafted a detailed compliance report with urgent recommendations for immediate remediation and notification of state authorities. I left the document on my desk, planning to sign and submit it the next morning. But when I arrived at the office early the next day, the folder was gone. I looked up to see Julian sitting in my chair, holding my report in one hand and a red pen in the other. He had crossed out entire paragraphs of my analysis and written his own numbers in the margins. He tossed the marked-up papers across the desk and told me he was fixing my overreactions. I picked up the report, my hands shaking as I looked at what he had done. He had reduced the heavy metal readings by more than half, bringing them just below the regulatory limit, and completely deleted the section about notifying the authorities. I told him these were not overreactions, but hard scientific data. People downstream were drinking this water. Julian stood up, towering over me, and sighed with theatrical impatience. He said nobody was going to get sick from a few parts per million of chemicals that exceeded arbitrary government limits. I countered that the limits were not arbitrary, but were based on decades of public health research. I explained that the levels we detected were dangerously high, not slightly elevated. Julian sneered, telling me that Clearwater Chemical was due to renew their multi-million-dollar contract next month. He said his uncle had made it clear that keeping this account was vital to our firm's survival. If we submitted my honest report, the client would have to suspend operations, costing them millions, and potentially causing them to drop our firm. I told him that if they did not make the repairs, the environmental damage would be catastrophic. Julian pulled a black flash drive from his pocket and dropped it on my desk. He said he had already drafted a revised version of the report. He ordered me to input my raw data into his template, adjust the numbers to match his clean conclusions, and submit it by 3 p.m. I stared at the flash drive, unable to process the scale of his dishonesty. I asked him if he was seriously ordering me to falsify environmental safety data. Julian's face hardened, the polite facade completely vanishing. He leaned in and told me that his uncle had put him in charge of this project, which meant I worked for him. I replied that we both worked to uphold the law and protect public safety. Julian let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He asked if that was the fairy tale I told myself to feel important, calling me a glorified dirt tester while boasting he was a Crawford and would own this entire firm one day. He repeated his demand, telling me to have the falsified report ready by 3 because he had a flight to catch. I picked up the flash drive in my original report, looking him dead in the eye, and told him I would not do it. I was going to submit the accurate findings. I stood there, feeling the weight of my decision. Over the last 7 years, I had worked under the belief that Crawford Environmental stood for something real. The company was founded on the principle that we were the last line of defense between industrial greed and public health. To see George's own nephew treat this sacred trust as nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be swept under the rug was sickening. I looked at the red ink defacing my report, realizing that Julian had not just changed numbers. He had compromised the safety of 17,000 innocent residents downstream. He wanted me to sign my name to a lie, using my professional license and credentials to shield his uncle's business from consequences. I knew that doing so would make me complicit in whatever illness or environmental disaster followed. I refused to let that happen, even if it cost me my job. I watched him walk away, his heels clicking loudly on the hardwood floor, completely indifferent to the ethical crisis he had just dropped on my desk. Julian's eyes narrowed, a cold rage replacing his previous smugness. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He warned me that I was making a career-ending move and that my stubbornness would get me thrown out onto the street. I replied that I was simply doing my job and maintaining my professional oath. I turned to walk away, hoping to take the files to George and explain the situation before Julian could spin his own version. But as I turned, Julian reached out and grabbed my forearm, his fingers digging into my skin with painful force. I froze, looking down at his hand, then back up at him. I demanded that he let go of my arm immediately. Julian did not release his grip. Instead, his voice rose, attracting the attention of several coworkers in the nearby cubicles. He screamed that I was nothing but a paper pusher, and that his uncle would support him over me any day of the week. He yelled that I needed to learn my place and stop making problems where none existed. I yanked my arm free with a sudden burst of energy, stepping back into the open space between our desks. I told him never to touch me again. My heart was pounding and my hands were trembling, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. I held the original report tightly against my chest, determined not to let him take it. That was the moment Julian completely lost control. His face contorted, turning a dark, bruised shade of red, and he lunged forward to grab the folder from my hands. I stepped backward, dodging his reach. Frustrated, Julian's eyes darted around his desk, landing on the heavy, solid metal stapler sitting next to his keyboard. In one fluid, violent motion, he grabbed the stapler and hurled it directly at my face. I ducked instinctively, feeling the wind from the heavy metal object as it whizzed past my ear. A split second later, there was a loud, cracking sound as the stapler smashed into the wall behind me, leaving a deep indentation in the drywall and clattering to the carpet. In the stunned silence that followed, Julian stood panting, his tie askew, looking slightly shocked by his own outburst. I was frozen in place, my heart hammering against my ribs as I looked at the damaged wall and the stapler on the floor. Before anyone could speak, the heavy oak door at the end of the corridor clicked open. Harvey Pierce, the compliance director for Clearwater Chemical, walked into the room. He had arrived early for our scheduled 1 o'clock meeting. In his hand, he held his smartphone, which was positioned horizontally, its screen glowing as it recorded the entire scene. Harvey slowly lowered the phone, his expression a mix of shock and intense disapproval. He looked from the dent in the wall to the stapler on the floor, and then at Julian, who had suddenly turned pale. Harvey remarked that he had come for our meeting but appeared to have walked into a dangerous situation. Julian attempted to stammer an explanation, claiming it was just a heated discussion that got out of hand. I interrupted, straightening my collar, and told Harvey that I was preparing to share the findings of our recent inspection. Harvey suggested we speak with Mr. George Crawford immediately. The next few hours were a chaotic blur. Julian was summoned into George's office, where he remained behind closed doors for a long time. When he finally came out, he refused to look in my direction and walked straight out of the building. Then George called me in. I walked into the office, expecting my boss to be horrified by his nephew's behavior. Instead, George looked tired and defensive. He began by saying that Julian had explained the misunderstanding, suggesting that I had misinterpreted a suggestion about report methodology as a demand to falsify data. I could not believe what I was hearing. I told George that Julian had explicitly ordered me to change the readings, to hide dangerous levels of contamination, and when I refused, he assaulted me with a stapler. I pointed out that Harvey Pierce had witnessed the aftermath and recorded the event. George's expression hardened, and he leaned forward. He said that Harvey only saw the end of the exchange and did not understand the context. He told me that while my findings were conservative, Julian's approach fell within acceptable professional parameters. He then informed me that I was being placed on 2 weeks of paid administrative leave while they conducted an internal review, and that the company would handle the Clearwater Chemical report. I stood up, my knees trembling with a mixture of shock and profound betrayal. I had spent 7 years dedicated to this firm, protecting its reputation and ensuring its clients remained compliant with the law. To see George dismiss a physical assault and cover up a massive environmental violation to protect his family member was a bitter pill to swallow. I asked him directly if he intended to submit the falsified report to the state board. George smiled tightly, telling me that they would submit a report that balanced their scientific obligations with client needs. As I packed my personal items under the watchful eye of an human resources representative, I saw Julian whispering with his uncle in the hallway, both of them looking at me with smug satisfaction. In that moment, I knew I could not let them win. I walked out of the building, my head held high, carrying a cardboard box containing my personal belongings, knowing that my relationship with the Crawford family was permanently severed. The 2 weeks of administrative leave felt like a long prison sentence. I had spent my entire adult life building my reputation as an honest professional, and now I was being pushed out of my own field. For the first few days, I stayed in my apartment, struggling with anger and sleeplessness. On the fourth morning, I received a text from Clara, the technician. She told me that the company had officially submitted Julian's sanitized report to the state board and to Clearwater Chemical. My stomach twisted. I knew what this meant. Real people downstream were going to continue drinking contaminated water because of Crawford Environmental's greed. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and decided to visit Oakhaven, the town closest to the chemical plant. I wanted to see the impact of this neglect with my own eyes. I went to the local diner where I met a waitress named Mabel. I asked her about the local water quality, and her friendly face darkened. She showed me a picture of her 6-year-old grandson, Toby, who had developed severe painful red rashes all over his limbs. She said 3 other children in his class had similar skin conditions, and the doctors could not find the cause. I spent the next several days visiting Valley Forge and Cedar Ridge, documenting the stories of residents who complained of metallic-tasting tap water, strange yellow stains on their laundry, and unusual film on standing water. I compiled all these details, connecting them directly to the heavy metal and nitrogen levels I had detected. On the 10th day of my leave, I received an unexpected phone call from Harvey Pierce. He told me that Clearwater Chemical had received the official report from Crawford Environmental, which indicated full compliance with only minor recommendations. I told him that the report was completely fabricated. Harvey paused, then admitted that he had worked in environmental compliance for more than 2 decades and knew when a report had been cleaned up. He asked me, off the record, if there were safety issues his family should worry about, as his niece lived in Valley Forge. I told him that I strongly recommended independent testing of the water supply for nitrogen compounds and heavy metals. Then, I asked Harvey about the video recording he had taken during the incident. He explained that company policy required him to submit the files to George Crawford, but he had kept a backup on his personal drive. This was the breakthrough I needed. I spent the next 48 hours reviewing the state environmental regulations and whistleblowers statutes. That was when I discovered the most critical piece of the puzzle. I called Clara to ask how they had submitted the report without my signature since I was the certified inspector of record. Clara checked the database and whispered that the submitted report had my electronic signature and professional seal stamped on the final page. My blood ran cold. I had never signed that document. Julian Crawford had copied my electronic signature and professional seal, applying them to the falsified report to make it look like I had approved the altered numbers. This was a direct violation of California Penal Code Section 470, which governs forgery. In administrative law, a document executed through forgery is void ab initio, meaning it has no legal standing from its inception. By forging my signature, Julian had made the entire submission legally invalid. Legally, Crawford Environmental had failed to submit a certified compliance report by the statutory deadline, exposing both the firm and Clearwater Chemical to massive civil and criminal penalties for environmental fraud. I immediately contacted Harvey Pierce and explained the legal situation. I told him that Julian's forgery had rendered the compliance report void ab initio and that Clearwater Chemical was currently operating under an illegal forged safety document. Harvey was horrified. He told me that the chemical company was hosting its annual stakeholder meeting this coming Friday, where Julian and George were scheduled to present the compliance report to the board and investors. I suggested that we use this meeting to expose the truth. I asked Harvey to invite independent testing experts and representatives from the affected communities of Oakhaven, Valley Forge, and Cedar Ridge. Harvey agreed, promising to make the arrangements. I spent the rest of my leave preparing my evidence. I built a detailed slide deck comparing the original safety metrics with the forged report submitted by Julian. I added photos of Toby's rashes and testimonials from the local residents. I knew that by taking the steps, I was risking my career and inviting massive retaliation. But looking at the photos of the children who were suffering because of our company's silence, I knew I had no choice. Some things are far more important than a paycheck or a title. I sent a series of encrypted emails to former colleagues at the regulatory board, letting them know that a major compliance issue would be exposed at the upcoming meeting, and I asked them to attend. I was ready to pull the plug, knowing that the confrontation would determine the future of my career and the safety of the entire valley. On Friday morning, I arrived at Clearwater Chemicals headquarters. The glass and steel building was filled with corporate executives and wealthy investors. With Harvey's help, I bypassed security and entered the main conference hall early. I went to the technical booth at the back and loaded my presentation onto the main computer. Soon, the room filled with board members, regulatory officials, and the representatives from Oakhaven, Valley Forge, and Cedar Ridge. I saw George Crawford and Julian enter. Julian looked confident in a brand-new pinstriped suit, completely unaware of what was waiting for him. Mr. George Crawford sat in the front row, adjusting his cuffs and smiling at a nearby investor, clearly believing this presentation would secure their financial future for years to come. At 10 o'clock, the meeting began. After several financial presentations, the CEO introduced Julian to share the environmental safety results. Julian walked to the podium and projected a series of colorful slides, claiming that the chemical plant met and exceeded all safety guidelines. He showed charts where the contamination levels were safely below the legal limits. I watched from the back as the community members shifted in their seats, their faces filled with quiet anger. Julian was smiling, basking in the approval of the room, believing he had successfully covered up the truth. He spoke with rehearsed poise, explaining that Crawford Environmental had run rigorous tests and found absolutely no hazards. That was when I stepped out of the booth and walked down the main aisle. I announced that the presentation was based on fabricated numbers and a forged document. The room went silent. Julian froze at the podium, his face turning pale as he demanded that security remove me, claiming I was a disgruntled employee on probation. But Harvey Pierce stood up and confirmed my identity, telling the board that I was the lead inspector on the project. The CEO, confused and concerned, allowed me to speak. I connected my flash drive and displayed the original inspection results on the massive screen. George Crawford jumped to his feet, shouting that my slides were fake, but his voice shook with sudden terror. I showed the REL bars where the nitrogen and heavy metal levels were 300% above the safety thresholds. I then explained the legal reality. I revealed that Julian Crawford had forged my signature and seal on the official report. I cited California Penal Code, Section 470, explaining that because the document was forged, it was void ab initio. I told the board that their compliance report did not legally exist, which meant Clearwater Chemical was in violation of state law for failing to submit a valid report, exposing them to massive liability. The legal department representatives on the board immediately exchanged panicked looks, recognizing the catastrophic implications of a report that was void ab initio. To back up my claims, Harvey Pierce projected the video of Julian's assault in the office, showing the metal stapler hitting the wall and Julian screaming. Next, I showed the photos of the children's rashes and introduced the independent scientists, who confirmed that their own tests of the Oakhaven water supply matched my original findings. One by one, Mabel and the other residents stood up to share their stories of how the contaminated water had affected their families. Mabel held up a photo of her grandson Toby, her voice cracking as she demanded to know why their health was treated as a disposable business expense. The board was in absolute shock, and the EPA representatives in the room immediately began taking notes. The meeting fell into complete chaos. The CEO announced an immediate internal investigation and suspended their relationship with Crawford Environmental. Within a month, the consequences were clear. The state board fined Clearwater Chemical heavily, forcing them to implement the remediation plan I had developed to clean up the Cedar Ridge tributary. Julian Crawford was arrested and charged with felony forgery under California Penal Code Section 470, while George Crawford's firm collapsed under the weight of multiple regulatory investigations. He retired in disgrace, his name ruined. As for me, I started my own consulting practice, Vance Compliance, with Clearwater Chemical as my first major client. My team now includes Clara and several other honest analysts who left Crawford Environmental. We dedicated ourselves to providing truthful, accurate assessments to ensure that communities are protected and corporations are held accountable. Looking back, I realized that standing up to corruption is never easy, but the truth has a way of finding its way to the light. If you have ever faced a similar situation, remember that your integrity is your most powerful asset. Like, subscribe, and share your own stories in the comments below. Together, we can make sure that public safety always comes before private profit, and that the voices of the communities we serve are never silenced by corporate greed. Thank you for listening, and remember to always stand up for what is right, no matter how difficult the path might seem.